Cool. Just to make sure we're talking to the right audience here. Is Joshua?
I am trying to track her down.
Okay. Rob just told me that he actually said, "I will not sit on a panel without another man." And
I will not sit on a panel.
oh, now he's gonna change it. So, just teasing. There's a lot of men, thank goodness, that are actually adamant about being on panels with at least one other woman. So, thank you, Rob. I'm just rousing him a bit. There's a huge group of women here, which is really wicked. That's really cool. And I've been in technology for 25 years. I've been in technology for about 25 years, and I've had really a handful of. I'm very fortunate to have a handful of male mentors and a couple of very influential female mentors. So I had the best of both worlds in growing up in technology. A little bit about myself, as most of you know already, I'm coming from the data center. I'm an expert in data center development and sales. That's what my background is and that's how I got into the blockchain space. It was actually by default, just being in the data center industry. And I do truly believe that blockchain is here to stay, and it's for the long term, but also cryptocurrencies in whatever form it may be, or tokens, coins, non-fungible tokens, et cetera. So you guys are at the right place, the right time. If you are learning about this for the first time or hearing about blockchain technology for the first time, you're in the right place. The team of people that are on this panel and some people here in the room are the experts in this field, whether it be blockchain, IoT, data, AI, et cetera. So we have one panelist missing, but we're going to get started anyway. Joshua is going to be here shortly, and she can introduce herself when she arrives. Rob, you go ahead and introduce yourself since you're the only man on the panel.
Diversity.
Please. Yes, we believe in diversity.
Hi, good evening or good afternoon. Rob Bailey. I am CEO of MState and then also a company in stealth. We invest in and build enterprise blockchain companies. I've been building enterprise software companies for 20 years. Since January of 2018, we've looked at 1,500 blockchain companies, of which maybe a quarter were supply chain. We've met with over 500, and we've invested in 7, which include a few supply chain blockchain companies. We're currently working with a few Fortune 500s on actually doing real build-out of some multi-business networks. And so it's been great to learn from some of the other great speakers here today.
Thank you. Alisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'll be quick. My name's Alisa DiCaprio. I'm head of trade and supply chain at R3. R3 is a company that builds the blockchain Corda. We don't build applications on top. It's just partners that build on top. We just build and maintain the blockchain platform.
Awesome. So I have a little bit of a controversial question for Rob. When I was sitting in the back and this gentleman that was up here on the panel, he first started talking about the power consumption. I looked around the room to see who was going to attack that question or attack that man. And Rob automatically put his hand up. So I was like, oh, somebody's going to address that. So I'd like to give him the opportunity to address that just for you guys to hear that. Is he still here, the gentleman that, I can't remember his name, did he leave? Okay, so unfortunately, he's not here to pick on, but okay, we're going to pick on him. Go ahead, Rob.
He may be waiting outside.
Yes, possibly.
Sure. So we're in the very early days of how blockchain can, as part of a stack typically, transform supply chains. And so I think it's really important to get first principles right, to get details right. And so being as passionate as I am, as all of you are, when I hear somebody share information, which I'm pretty sure is not the case, I feel pretty passionate about trying to correct it because I want to make sure that everybody out there learns the right stuff and not the wrong stuff. I think one of the things that he mentioned earlier was around the power consumption of consensus. And I think he was conflating two things, which you actually did a great job of starting to explain. So a lot of them, there's a variety of, blockchain is used to coordinate multiple parties. There's lots of different ways of getting to consensus. What he was referring to is a lot of the media that's happened around proof of work, which is a consensus-based algorithm that is typically used, for example, with Bitcoin, and for a few more months with Ethereum, if Ethereum 2.0 comes out when it's supposed to, that has been claimed to use large amounts of energy for Bitcoin mining. Although some research studies will show that it's something as much as 60 to 70% of the energy being expended in proof of work is actually renewable, so not quite so bad. But typically when we're looking at enterprise blockchain, we're looking at closed permission systems. Tangela mentioned using Hyperledger Fabric. We have another great protocol up here with us, and they do not do proof of work. They use a variety of different other consensus-based algorithms, which are pretty energy efficient from a computational standpoint.
Thank you very much for addressing that. I used to work for a company called Emerson Electric, Emerson Network Power. So I am very familiar with power consumption for mining facilities and data centers, which are two different types of facilities for running data and mining cryptocurrency. So if you can run your computer, if you can run your application, an application on your mobile device, you're able to run a node. So just to address that first and foremost, if you're able to run a server, you're able to run a node, and then you're able to run a blockchain. So just to address that. I have my question for you is, after seeing these presentations today, and I get asked this quite often, so I think it's kind of, I finally get to ask somebody this. After seeing these presentations today, it's kind of overwhelming, the amount of information, amount of knowledge that the people that presented have. Do you need a degree from MIT to actually run a blockchain solution? That's a legitimate question, because a lot of people are intimidated by this information.
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting. So, with Corda, R3 started as a consortium of banks, and we've expanded out past that. But initially, what happened is, we would kind of go into a bank and we would talk to the developers, and we're like, hey, so, we work with your product manager. They're thinking about doing this blockchain thing, and the developers would be so excited. They're like, well, finally, like we've been waiting to do this. So I think with the existing technical resources that are already available, in a lot of the companies that are doing this, it's absolutely not a problem at all. I mean, I guess we see two different models, in R3. The first model is where the particular corporate or bank is using its own internal systems to scale up and learn how to do blockchain, how to build blockchain applications. And the other is there's a million people whose sole interest is in building blockchain applications. So they can go out, they can work with consultancies, they can work with startups. I think there's a lot of resources that you don't need yourself to be able to build this.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. I've been asked that question so many times, and I've automatically responded with, I don't have a degree from MIT, but I'm able to understand it. But it has taken time to be able to understand the vocabulary and learn. So if you're here today, you're getting started and learning, please reach out to me. I have a whole reading list. I've sent it around the world many times. It's on GitHub if you search for GitHub reading list, or I can send it to you, just ping me. And you can start learning from there. So I have another question for you real quick. Triple T's, Trump, trade, and troubles. Tell me how you see and how supply chain is affected by the Triple T.
God. All right.
You are on a panel. I have to ask you questions.
No, of course. I know, and I think this is really exciting because I mean, there's a lot of things that have been happening, particularly in the tariff space, when what is happening in the U.S. is ridiculous and is changing so quickly that it's changing the cost and the pricing of what's happening. So if you remember that story back, this is in the beginning of the tariff war, right? When the Peak Pegasus was the ship that was on its way to China, right before the retaliatory tariffs were going to be implemented. If that ship got there, it was going to, have the regular tariffs, the regular price. If it didn't get there in time before the implementation of tariffs, it was going to, have
Be subject to that.
exactly. And it didn't. It missed the deadline by like 5 hours, and so the entire shipment was like $5 million more expensive than it would have been otherwise. So I think this absolutely has an impact on what is happening. And what's interesting about blockchain in this case, right? And we don't, to be totally transparent, we don't see a whole lot of movement in the government space. We see a lot of testing. We don't see customs implementing it right away. We see a lot of sandboxes and things like that. If it had been implemented, it would have been much easier and much more transparent to be able to transform the cost of that, the pricing of that, the insurance on it, which would have been enacted faster than just waiting for the ship to show up and hoping it was there.
And how would blockchain actually address something like that? And I know that's not a quick answer, but just off the top of your head, how would blockchain address something, more problems like this across the entire supply chain industry? How does it help? How does it facilitate? How does it give visibility, for example?
Okay, so I think there's two ways, right? And both of them are going to be like very much forward-looking, right? Like this is not going to happen tomorrow. I think one of them is going to be in terms of how we implement countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties, and the other one is really around the insurance part of this. So in terms of anti-dumping and countervailing duties, the difficulty of that is calculating them. And so the more that's on blockchain, the easier that becomes because it's more transparent what the prices were for the goods, what the marginal cost is of producing them. So that would be one aspect. The other is insurance. And I would use a slightly different example using one of the projects that we have built on Corda called InsureWave. And what InsureWave does is it's meant to, hello.
Hi, how are you?
If you haven't noticed already, Joshua is now here. She's arrived.
A little bit wet, but
That's all right. There's a lot of rain, isn't there?
not a lot of cats.
No. Okay, so just to let you finish. Go ahead.
Oh, right. So the insurance thing. This is actually really cool. So right now, the way that insurance is done is before the ship ever leaves the port, the insurance contract is calculated, and it's a very linear process, and then it's input, and the insurance contract is executed or not at the end of the journey, right? So what happens between when the ship leaves the first port and arrives at the second one? The insurance doesn't do anything. But what InsureWave did is it's marine and hull insurance. And so because the ship itself, and you see this with a lot of different projects as well, has a lot of data between those two ports, right? It has weather data, GPS data, the state of the containers, the temperature, all of this, which could affect insurance, right? I mean, that could be automatically implemented if you knew that the ship, there was a fire on the ship and half the stuff burned up. Well, then that could be automatically implemented. You would know through a smart contract, right? And you would know and be able to order more, for example. That is not the case today. So what InsureWave does is it allows this sort of behavior-based insurance, which is really exciting and allows us to make the supply chain much more efficient by not waiting the month and a half or whatever until it gets to port.
Excellent answer. Rob, I'm going to let Joshua take a little breath and calm down a little bit, but Rob, I have a quick question for you. I know you've looked at multiple different types of applications or dApps running across the supply chain. Just to give us an idea, what have you seen that is actually very impressive to address the challenges?
I think it's still really early days, but we're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation happening on the part of Fortune 500s. So, for example, love what Maersk is doing. How many Maersk people are still here? Yay! There you go, way in the corner. Love what Maersk is doing. I think there's a bunch of Fortune 500s that have announced publicly interesting stuff they're doing. Walmart with their food safety program, as well as I would say it's sort of like an iceberg effect in the sense that for every one project that you're reading or hearing about, there's probably 10 to 20 that you haven't heard about that are private. On the startup side, we've just seen a phenomenal number of different projects. I would guess, I'm biased, but one in particular that I really like is Brick. Disclaimer, we're an investor. They're basically actually connecting up the supply chain around massive construction projects on the blockchain. And you were making some comments before around insurance and the access that insurance companies have to information around shipping. If you could reduce the complexity and data tracking around major construction projects, you'd save so much money on insurance discovery that the technology pays for itself. So I like Brick. I also like companies that are making supply chain and blockchain intersections more accessible. So companies like Blockdaemon that are doing easy plug and play node deployment, and Bison Trails are great as well.
And you invested in Blockdaemon as well, just out of
Yes.
curiosity?
I am.
Yeah, okay. Just checking.
Oh, I have that.
I asked Rob that because I know how many companies come to him and say, hey, we're looking for investment, and Rob goes into great detail from a technical perspective and a team perspective to make sure that his investment is going to see into the future, but also address the use cases in the marketplace. So that one of the reasons why I ask you to shill a little bit. I know you're not going to back away from an investment that you see that is a viable investment. So I was kind of a loaded question because I know that you invested in some amazing companies. And
There's tons of other ones, though. I love what Tangilla is building with TradeFlow. I think a year ago when we were on a panel together, you were talking about kind of exploring blockchain, and you've now, in a year, built a real business. So love what Tangilla is building. What Chronicle's doing in pharma is fantastic. I mean, the list could go on and on. We did an index recently of the top 100 most interesting enterprise blockchain companies. About a quarter of them were supply chain.
that was awesome.
And there is just a phenomenal number of companies out there innovating. I think there's a lot of still open questions, like are closed permission systems or are public chains the right answer? How do you properly integrate with backend ERPs? What is the role of automation? You both were talking about automation. How does automation fit into data normalization for multi-party coordination? I think there's a bunch of questions that are still open, but I'm just blown away with the incredible founders that are out there building stuff.
Absolutely. Jeremy Fiel is here. He's building some amazing things too. If you guys get a chance to talk to him, I'm always impressed when I talk to him and listen to what he's building and doing. There's also companies like Steam Chain, Basic Blocks that are really cool organizations that are building as well. So those are ones to check out. I haven't invested in either one of those or Jeremy's company either. So, but I would because they're on the cutting edge of this technology, but very much in the supply chain. So, Joshua, over to you. Please tell us about yourself a little bit.
Oh, sure. So I'm Josh Klayman. I'm a lawyer in the space. I see some familiar faces. I've been in the space for a number of years. I have a law firm called Klayman LLC. I have a consulting firm called Inflection Blockchain Advisors, and I chair the legal working group of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. So I just have a great love of the space. By background, I'm a finance lawyer.
Thank you very much for introducing yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that you see from a legal standpoint, and also the most remarkable things that have come up over the past couple of years that have really taken a while to actually address in the marketplace? Because I know from a legal standpoint, if you don't have your legals right, then you're up against the clock, but up against the many regulatory bodies. But those are from a legal standpoint, those are some of the largest, biggest challenges and resource drainers in a startup, and also when you're building a blockchain solution. So I'll hand it over to you. Please tell us what you've been experiencing.
Sure. So I think you can break those into a few different chunks, right? Because blockchain is crossing so many geographies, it's not just one set of laws, right? Not just one. Even in the United States, right? We have many states. When things cross state lines, or depending on the way the law is structured, state laws may apply. Of course, there's a global nature to blockchain, as you guys all know. So there are other nations' laws that come into play as well. So for example, to the extent that anything that you're dealing with might have personally identifiable data, you need to think about things like GDPR and other privacy concerns from day one, right? From the architecture phase. because some of this is very difficult, as you know, to undo, right, once you have something on chain. In terms of the actual nature of whatever it is that you're doing, that's important to remember too, and I think that gets lost a lot, right? Because we talk about, oh, is something a security? Is it a commodity? Is it, what's the consideration here? How do we treat it for tax purposes? But you have to also remember whatever industry you're in and whatever the laws are specific to that industry or that area. So for example, if you're dealing with healthcare and healthcare records, you still have to worry about things like HIPAA and other concerns that are specific to the nature of whatever it is you're doing. I imagine if you're dealing with things that involve food safety, you have to worry about laws implicating or that are affected by and affect food safety. So I think bearing that in mind from a macro level is important to remember. So I think that's one part of the conversation. I think in terms of what I've seen and what may be taking longer, I can say when I got into this space, I got into it being a lawyer who was representing, among others, a lot of banks. I started hearing about smart contracts and that they were going to be used to reduce legal spend. And so I thought at the time, back a few years ago, that we would see much faster enterprise adoption, right? I thought that things like that would be much quicker. I didn't know at the time that, of course, ICOs and all sorts of other fundraising projects would kind of take force. I thought that things would be further along in that regard. I also think that in 2016, in August, the World Economic Forum had put out its Future of Financial Infrastructure report, and they identified several use cases that they thought would be good use cases. One of which was trade finance. So that's tying back to here, just because it's a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year industry. I would have thought that we would be further along in that. I am excited by many projects I'm seeing, but I think one of the challenges has really been the incumbents, because you can say very much like, oh, this is an industry dominated by bills of lading and faxes and all these sorts of inefficiencies. But then we have to remember, like, there are people who actually send those faxes and people who actually sign those bills of lading. So I think that has been has slowed some of the adoption. But I think there's such exciting things going on. I mean, some of the projects you mentioned, like someday you could end up with an Alexa fridge, right? Where you take that apple out, you look at, and it says, don't eat it, don't eat it. It's been recalled, or there was a bad, I don't know, an outbreak of something. So I think that's kind of exciting to think about how other emerging technologies can integrate. Because I think one of the cool things about supply chain is you can think of almost anything as a supply chain. If you think about processes, right? So I think in that sense, breaking down processes into steps and breaking down information about what is moving, I think there are many different. I'm not going to name projects that I think are like the best.
That's okay. Don't worry. Everybody has their own projects that they're interested in. One of the biggest challenges that I see in the market is that technology is changing so rapidly in the blockchain and IoT data AI space. How do you keep up with it all? So my questions to you guys is where is your free resource, number one, for everybody out there that wants to learn more and quickly? And also, what is your plan of attack when you do see a new technology coming out there? I mean, I have a certain process that I like to share. I like to read the white paper, for example, first and foremost. Like, for example, this announcement with Facebook and Libra. Does anybody know what that is? All right, sorry, it's a joke. But I like to find out about the first and foremost. I like to read the white paper. I like to dissect it a little bit, and I like to try to apply it in my mind, which takes a little bit of deep thinking. But I also want to know from the panelists, what is your process of dissecting new technology, just so those that are building or all those that want to learn about the new technology or new applications or dApps out there, how do you first and foremost attack new technology or new applications out there, dApps out there, but also where are you getting your resources? Where's your best resource, Rob?
She's going to need it next, so go ahead. I think it depends on the context. but I always strongly focus on builders. So when I'm looking at new technologies, when we're considering evaluating, investing in a company, we talk to developers, we try to use the product and try to build with the product and talk to other people that have built with the product. So that's where we start the journey. There is a flood of other different data sources that you can look to as well. Twitter's a great source of information, company websites, Telegram groups, meetups, etc. I actually have a pretty long list that I look to for data, whether we're evaluating a company as an investment or as a recommendation of Fortune 500 we're working with. Personally, for me, the white papers are a little further down the list.
Yeah, I guess, so Corda is a blockchain. We don't really build the other technologies out. But when, partners come to us and say, I'm building a supply chain solution with IoT, and IoT is like the Wild West, right? I mean, there's a million companies that are building all kinds of crazy things, some of which is really useful and helpful, and some of which is like, I'm not actually sure it's real. So I think for us, we really rely on the partners that are building. And to do that evaluation, we help them out if we need to. But what our goal is to make sure that the blockchain that we're built, that Corda is actually able to integrate with them, right? So if somebody is using IoT and they're like, hey, I'm going to put radar data on the blockchain, we're like, maybe you don't want to do that because it's going to make your application really, really slow, and there's like not really any reason you need that. So it's for us, it's more of a explaining how the technology would work with the blockchain, and then what we would need to do, if anything, to change the platform to make it useful.
Both of you have touched on a fascinating topic. You in the case of Chronicle and you with IoT, which is this intersection of devices and blockchains. Would love to hear more from both of you about kind of how you see that intersection working. I think we definitely have a range of experience in the crowd, but I'd love to hear kind of how you're seeing that intersection of IoT devices and blockchain as a coordination and data repository tool.
Sure. Should I also answer the other thing, or
Yes,
or no?
please.
Okay. All
I'm
right,
going to
so-
moderate from now on, Rob.
Okay. So, and the other question was
Your free
escaped me.
resources
Oh, yeah.
and
I
process of evaluating new technology and new apps out there in the market.
Thank you. So I do read white papers, but kind of further down on the list. Although, frankly, with Facebook's, I of course read it. But I think for me, a lot of times it's who is on the team, and whether what the general sense of because I'm a lawyer, right? I'm not by background. I'm not a technologist by background. I'm not an investor by background. I'm a lawyer. So when people come to me and they say they want legal representation, or there's a new project that wants information, often I'll see who's backing them in terms of, do they have any early investors, and are they people that I'm aware of. I'll see okay, has this person had a business before in the space or something adjacent, and have they been successful, or do they have a deep background in the industry that they're trying to go into? I think that for all of the negative stuff that's said about the blockchain space sometimes by people outside of it, I think there's actually incredibly good vetting that's done in terms of those who are investing. I think that people, to a greater or lesser extent, not in every case, but people through a process of, I guess, iterative reviews of some sort, who are the real people building real things versus salespeople, right? Who don't necessarily have something that
Or
they can
marketing.
bring.
Not,
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's
not
what
to
I mean.
slam any salespeople. in
Yeah,
here.
no, I don't mean anything bad about
I know.
salespeople. I meant
I know, I'm
hype,
just teasing. I'm just teasing. So, go ahead.
And I was going to say, for your question in terms of the interaction, when I think about this entire space, I think about convergence, right? I don't think that blockchain for some people, this is a cynical view, but some large enterprises and others, they could very well be saying, hey, look, this is just an opportunity to upgrade our technology, right? Upgrade our back end, right? They might not be part of a vision of anything. Other people may be saying, well, my competitors are doing this, I need to figure out what I'm doing, it's a defensive posture. Other people may have an exciting vision. But when I think of it, I don't think of it in a vacuum. I think of, okay, as we have AI, developing more and more and IoT developing more and more, that this talks to each other, that it's going to, I just see it as a convergence. And
Yeah,
I think
this is a great opportunity, and I was speaking with a manufacturer the other day. It's a great opportunity to, if those companies out there have not upgraded their systems every 3 to 5 years, it's a great way, if you haven't updated your system in the past 5 to 10 years, it's a great way to leapfrog the technology of yesteryear to the new technology that is out there today. That was my next question, and thank you very much. But not exactly the same. But where do you see IoT, blockchain, and supply chain actually coming to a head where it actually is going to make a huge difference? And I know that we're in the build stage right now, but there's, we're in the build and production stage right now. Let me just correct myself. And when you do look at the 3 topics of conversation actually coming and converging, where does that actually meet is my question that Rob stole. But I'm okay with that. Go ahead, Joshua, real quick.
so. This is not necessarily supply chain focused. Let me just pull back for a moment. But as a lawyer, for example, with smart contracts, which can obviously, be used in supply chains and many other things. Certain things, you have a computer code, right? But then you have natural language contracts. And there are certain aspects of it, such as reasonableness and others, right? That traditionally people say, oh, well, you need lawyers or you need human beings to be thinking about this or thinking about materiality, all these sorts of things. Well, with increases and developments in AI, I mean, it's entirely possible that you could have something where, the interpretation of what is reasonable or what is material could be determined based on cases, and maybe AI can come up with something that is more close to what's deemed to be reasonable based on every case that ever was than I could. Right?
I could have guessed that you were going to say smart contracts from a legal perspective. Your opinion, what would be the area where they converge and they really make a difference, that point of contact where you go, wow, that's where they cross over?
Okay, so I guess I have 2 thoughts on this. The first is, with IoT, what we're seeing on Corda is IoT being used in a B2B transaction. It's not the retail-facing part of this. But to be honest, almost every single application builder is like, I want consumers to be able to know where this good came from. They're going to scan it. They're going to use it, whatever. But there's no business case for that. There's no evidence that any consumer is going to pay more for a solution that uses blockchain because they can scan it and find out where it is. In fact, I mean, if you think about the Cargill case, right, with the Thanksgiving turkeys, and so they had it on the blockchain. You could scan it if you wanted to. Almost no one did it. It was extremely low uptake, right? So do consumers want that? It's very unclear.
I have to challenge you on that. If the infrastructure was there and the knowledge about blockchain was actually out there and understood to the masses, do you think the uptake would have been a little bit better?
No. I think the uptake was as high as it was because it had things like recipes on it. It wasn't that they were just learning where the turkeys came from.
Good
questions. Do you want to?
Just a minute. I have to ask Rob because I don't want to bypass the man on the panel. Please tell me the conversion.
That sounds so terrible. I don't want to say anything.
Equal rights. Rob, go.
You raised your hand.
I just wanted to say, had there been an outbreak of salmonella, things would have been different, right?
Possibly romaine lettuce. Yes.
Yeah, we're actually seeing some corner cases that consumers do have a strong need to do tracking, not necessarily in your suggested use case where somebody wants to look something up, but they do want to ensure food safety throughout the supply chain. We're working with one major supermarket chain right now that is going crazy trying to validate their entire supply chain for nut allergy safety. And that's a really big deal. So for sufferers and their families of severe nut allergies, the tracking provenance and ensuring that, for example, a product wasn't produced in a factory where there's nuts could be a big deal. But I agree with what you said that I haven't really seen a lot of consumers really doing the pull yet. I think where you're going is probably more that it's B2B.
Right. I mean, the issue is, so, my background is as an economist, and we used to do these kind of studies for labor standards. So, like, are you willing to pay a little bit more for your T-shirt because we certify that it's not made by child labor? And
at the commodity level, people were not. At the luxury level, absolutely. And I think that's the same thing that we're seeing here. If you're paying for a luxury good, yes, you will use this, you'll pay more for it. But on the other side of the coin, to your point about the nut allergies, it's going to make your consumers doubt you, because your consumers are like, you are already telling me this wasn't made in a factory with nuts, and now you're telling me that I need this other thing to track it, and you were actually maybe wrong. So I mean, that's what we've seen as well in that space, in the retail space, is it's difficult for them to say, hey, we need this thing, and we weren't doing it really well before.
I think when they incentivize the scanning of products, then if you get like a discount code when you scan a QR code, I think you're absolutely right, or a recipe, then you'll probably have a little bit more engagement. Until it becomes, like you said, with the nut allergies. I have an allergy to spinach because of the pesticides that are used. If I grow it in my backyard, I don't have seizures when I eat spinach. But so it makes a huge difference to me to understand what is put on vegetables, for example. So very good point. We have a couple of questions.
Question over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the convergence issue. We're actually seeing a test case of that emerge in container shipping right now with TradeLens, which has been referred to. Maersk has gotten its two biggest rivals to join TradeLens on the blockchain side of things. All three of those carriers are now using a technology that was developed by one of the carriers, or a subsidiary of one of the carriers, to track the location of containers with physical sensors. And then you have those three carriers are also part of a standard setting organization that's trying to define, data standards that would, so you're starting to see this like convergence and loop where all three of these organizations and initiatives could potentially feed into one another. So
Rob's going to respond.
Oh, sorry. That's an awesome point. And actually, sort of circling back to your question, I put simply what we're seeing is that blockchain becomes a multi-party coordination layer and data repository, and IoT devices of all kinds, whether they're IoT devices on cargo boxes or, containers, or cold chain temperature detection devices in trucks, they're just a data input. So what we're seeing is increasingly as supply chains go from analog and data silos to being completely digital, you're looking at permission-based sharing of data, and for example, you might have the devices on the containers, the temperature controls, which are devices whose data output is interesting and they want to have it consumed by multiple companies, and blockchain becomes the data transmission network for that to happen.
Thank you. So I truly believe, and I'll just answer my own question, or Rob's question to begin with, where it converges, and this is kind of, I was working in the 90s and the early 2000s in the dot-com boom, and when you have a mobile device, a smart mobile device, that's when the internet actually makes sense to the world. So when you have infrastructure for blockchain, IoT, and data and AI to actually converge, when you have that piece, that physical device, or the IoT devices that actually are collecting data, I think that's going to be the convergence where it actually says without that, it doesn't make sense. Without our mobile phones, smart money, digital money, commerce really doesn't make as much sense. I mean, can you imagine commerce, the way we do commerce, Amazon, for example, without our mobile devices? So I think that piece of technology, that infrastructure actually made it all make sense up until now. So you were going to say something? Sorry. Did I? No?
No,
Okay.
actually, so I've one point about that. I mean, I think before we can have this conversation about IoT and whether it's working or not, we need to have a conversation about how affordable it is. Because right now, every single place where we see IoT being used, it's the buyer paying for that, for the supply. It's just too expensive right now to make it. I mean, of course, costs are coming down and whatever, but not
Mobile
yet.
phone costs are coming down too.
Are they? Are they?
Yeah, I think, who was it that created a $99 phone? Help me out here.
And Samsung just created like a $2,000 phone. Like it's slow.
The infrastructure is coming down. I sold mobile, sorry?
Don't doubt me.
Yes, thank you. I sold mobile phones in the late 90s, early 2000s. I had 3 mobile phone stores, and there were billboards saying, call 1-800 whatever, and you'll get your mobile phone sent to your home. And my dad was like, why are you opening up mobile phone stores? People are just going to call the 1-800 number. So I believe that the technology actually is becoming more affordable, and I think that IoT devices will be the same thing. Infrastructure will come down just as all devices, physical devices.
Actually, blockchain can make IoT devices more affordable. And that is because when you have multiple different parties in a supply chain actually sharing the data that is derived from an IoT device, you can have multiple parties theoretically actually financing and funding that device.
Absolutely. I totally 100% agree. We have a question right here. Do you have a, oh, good.
If I may, a follow-up question regarding IoT and its use. You mentioned putting IoT data on blockchain.
Or the representation of.
Yeah, because getting back to definition, blockchain requires all of the participants in the blockchain to validate the data, right? And if I generate the data with my IoT devices and I'm simply putting it on blockchain, is that still blockchain?
So you're putting the representation of the data, I'll hijack that. You're putting the representation of the data on a blockchain. You're not putting the data itself on the blockchain. And also, there was something else that I wanted to say to that, and now I've lost my train of thought.
the permission. So I mean the permissioning.
Permission-based access, sorry.
Right. So like when I was talking about radar data, you don't want that on blockchain. But what you could use it for is the blockchain to permission who has access to that data and when they use it.
Michael?
I'll help. So there's a really important technology in the context of this called content addressability, where you have data that's stored somewhere else and you can prove that it's the right data because you have a hash of the data. And so there's a variety of different ways to use that technology, but the point is at the first level, you can have like a guarantee that you've gotten the thing that you were told that you have the right to get, and you don't have to store that thing in the same place that you're using to agree that you have the right to get it. And that separation is adding in more technologies than we need to get into, but it's not strictly a blockchain. I think someone earlier said stacks of technologies working together to make this work.
Yes. Did we address your question, by the way, this gentleman here?
Because there are lots of solutions out there that provide aggregation, collect lots of data from lots of places, and control content visibility, accessibility to that data. But apart from the provider of the data vouching that the data is accurate, there is no independent verification by another party that the data is correct.
Yeah, when I spoke earlier, I think that certainly blockchains, even closed permission systems, are probably not the most economically efficient repository for all data around, say, sensor data. But I think you can do things like track like arrivals or summary data where there might need to be some kind of a consensus. And now I'm going to say something really controversial. I actually think there is a massive opportunity around consensus algorithms to be better applied for supply chain, and I know that R3 is doing some really good work here. What I mean by that is the type of consensus that is derived for approving, who's going to affirm a new block in digital currency is very different than supply chain. So I think we're in the really early days of the intersection of supply chain and blockchain. We're already seeing some huge wins in progress, but I think one of the biggest opportunities that needs to be addressed is protocols that are built from the ground up, specifically for how supply chains operate and how data is shared across enterprise supply chains.
Very good point. We have a question over here.
So Industry 4.0, blockchain, all these new technologies disrupting traditional work is sort of an assumption of all of this conversation. But in the last panel or earlier today, one of the gentlemen had said, this blockchain thing, it's the least of my worries right now. I can't afford to handle this. It's just like it's a glorified database. I have other problems to deal with. And, as, counter to everything else that sounds, of probably the vast majority of freight companies, logistics companies, fleets, and certainly in the New York area, are kind of feeling that way. They're relatively small. They've been operating with a certain model for decades. It's been working more or less, and at the very least, they just can't afford to shift that, especially if kind of the customs infrastructure is still not there yet. So 2 questions. One, when do you think it'll get to that point of de-risking that it is inevitable or worth it for these smaller companies to jump in? And 2, what do you think those companies need to facilitate that transition?
One of the biggest challenges right now, and this is why I asked resources from these incredible people here, is education. And once you have education, then your mind actually starts to expand to application. And then it expands to, oh, I have a use case, and oh, maybe I need to do some research on the different options I have out there based on my use case. So really at the fundamental level, I think in supply chain and those smaller organizations, education is first and foremost. It is easier to take the new technology that is out there, and I'm saying this because I'm not in the logistics field at all, and I am not one of those small suppliers to the industry. But I see it, as far as a technologist goes, I see it as easier to educate yourself on what is out there and take the use cases or the pains that you do have and try to apply what you have learned before you completely dismiss it. And that's the first and foremost. If you get to the bottom at the end of the day of you researching and you say, or the end of the year you researching and you say, I don't have a real use case for this, talk to some of the industry leaders in the blockchain space to see what kind of applications or dApps that are out there addressing some of the use cases out there. So I'm going to pretend like I'm on the panel and just answer that question, but I'm going to hand it over to some of the people here. Can you address that? I think from each of our standpoints, we all have different perspectives on this. I'm really coming from the platform build, sales, technology, and I truly believe the use cases. I'm also a purist. I'm an Ethereum purist also, so I believe in the Ethereum protocol. I think it's going to be around for a long time, but that might be just controversial also. Silence. So actually, please answer this question, this gentleman's question.
I mean, well, to a certain extent, I think some things, if you are talking about smaller companies, if you analogize it and you think about, say, like Walmart looking into supply chain versus like a bodega, right, like in the city. Like, are they going to necessarily be moving to blockchain soon? Maybe not. Maybe it doesn't, maybe they don't need, maybe the return on investment just isn't there yet. But while the larger companies that do have money to spend on experimentation, that do have staff, that do have bandwidth to look into this and find cost savings, then I think smaller companies can learn from them, frankly. Because often the smaller companies are not the direct competitor in the traditional sense to the larger companies. I mean, I think like to some people who say, oh, why are we getting, look, why is Facebook getting in this? Why is Walmart, all these other large organizations, that's sort of just replicating the existing. Well, it's paving a path. And to your point about education, but also it's figuring out a lot of bumps along the road so that individual entrepreneurs maybe don't have to in the same way.
Okay, so I would answer this in a slightly different way. When I joined R3 about a year and a half ago, a lot of my job was going out to companies and being like, hey, you really need blockchain. And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, no, you do. And it was, trying to convince them. And then, fast forward to now where I spend most of my time in meetings, companies coming to me going, I really want blockchain. And I'm like, what do you want it for? They're like, don't know. Just something. Like, help me figure out what that is. So I think there's been a shift in the industry where there is now this curiosity about like, okay, what can I do? Everybody else is doing it. And like, I actually have to be like, you really don't need blockchain for your thing. Like, it's really fine the way it is. But then, also to the point about small enterprises, I think what we're seeing in small enterprises, yeah, they're not the ones investing in blockchain. That would be ridiculous. It doesn't really make sense because if you're a small company, you don't have a lot of resources and you're not like super stable. So you don't want to, do something that's like kind of cutting edge. But what we do see is that their banks are using it. And that maybe, the buyer is using it. Maybe their insurance company is using it. So they are touching blockchain. It's not that they're completely, separated from it. And I think ultimately that will come towards them, but so I think that's just a slightly different perspective on that.
Let me offer, I guess, a different perspective. So the third different perspective. I've worked with a company of all sizes in the last year, and most of them definitely take this kind of future-resistant approach, especially in an industry like shipping. And I've been asked that question, well, both questions a lot. Is blockchain just a database? And should I bother with blockchain? And what I say to them is actually, inaction is the worst possible strategy. And what I would suggest instead is start with getting smarter on the technology. So educating yourself on the different standards. And the really interesting thing about the early days of the technology is that there is a massive premium placed on adoption. And for even small companies, if you move quickly on a new technology, you can actually leverage other people's money, put simply. What I mean by that is specifically if you're a smaller port and you're considering whether or not to get involved with blockchain, you can totally just put your head in the sand and wait 5 years. Or you can take advantage of the situation right now, and if you look, for example, there's still a fair amount of competition going on between Maersk and the other consortium, I think GBSN, and GSBN. And for a small port, if they were to pick a side in that battle, especially the more well-funded side, they may find that they actually could build a stronger relationship with Maersk and potentially have most, if not all, of their development paid for by a third party. So I think there's a tremendous advantage to being an early mover if you do it in a smart way.